I want to debunk some myths that I hear floating around about the math section, just so we're on the same page, so we know what to expect. Because again, half the battle is knowing what the SAT math section tests and how it tests it, and then equally what it doesn't test and what you're not expected to do. So a lot of the name of the game in improving in the math section and in the SAT in general is knowing the test. So let's debunk some myths. Myth number one, the SAT tests advanced math. It really doesn't. It basically goes up to the first 2 years of high school math. So we're talking about Algebra 1, geometry, and maybe a touch of Algebra 2. But there's no trig, no pre-calc, and even within the Algebra 1, Algebra 2 stuff, it doesn't get super complicated. There's no logs, not really much stuff on exponentials. So the math in itself is not super difficult in terms of the content. What is difficult is how they use that, how they make questions out of what they do test. And in fact, sometimes what's hard is that they bring up old concepts like remainders. So stuff you've done way back in elementary school or middle school, grade school, that you haven't done for many years, and they actually bring that back. So the irony is sometimes it's easier math, like basic math, that is actually the hard part. Myth number two, SAT solutions are complicated. No, most of the time you can get answers done in about 30 seconds. So most of the answers will be, once you know what to do, it's pretty straightforward. It's going to be some simple computation, just like adding two numbers together or multiplying a few numbers. Very rarely are you going to have pages and pages and pages of computation. Almost never. And when you do, it'll be, you'll be doing more work for like a 19 or a 20, a hard question. Most of the time, you can solve questions in about 30 seconds or less. Once you know what to do, of course, solving the question can take less than 30 seconds. It just goes like that. But again, the trick is getting to that point where you know what to do, know how to tackle the question, and then once you do that, like the hard part's over, as long as you don't make any silly computational mistakes. Myth number three, the SAT is like a high school math test. No, it is completely different from a high school math test. In a high school math test, you're trying to basically repeat or show your teacher that you can do what the teacher has done on the blackboard, right? You're basically just repeating, mimicking what the teacher has done on problems you've seen before, in homework and quizzes and class, right? There's really no surprises often on most math tests. Where in the SAT, the questions are more like brain teasers or puzzles. That's the way I like to think about them. So they use concepts and they use math in certain ways, but in unexpected ways, things we're not used to. And that's the big challenge. If you approach this test like a high school math test, you're going to have some issues because you're going to be looking for solutions that aren't there. And the test makers, the College Board, know this is the case. They know what you're used to in your math class, and they're going to build a test to exploit that and try to trick you. So that's why it's about knowing what the SAT math is like as SAT math, not as something you're used to, say, in high school. If you know all the math content, you'll get an 800. No, and I think the best proof of this is I work with students who are in calculus classes who can barely get through the 600s. And you would think, well, how is this possible? How is someone in calculus not getting out of the 600s? And it's because they know all the math in the world, but it's not about that. It's not about the content. It's how do you use it? How do you solve problems with it? And then finally, myth number 5, SAT math is just math. It's actually not just math. It's actually almost as much a test of reading as it is of math. In fact, the entire test is a reading test. If you can't take a problem that might be a relatively complex looking problem and break it down into pieces, it's going to be very hard no matter how good you are at math to solve it. That's why a lot of the times doing these problems are basically about reading and understanding text in addition to doing the math. So the SAT math is, of course, math, but it also requires a certain reading skill. So we're going to talk about how we break down questions, how we figure out all their pieces, and all that good stuff. So let's move on to the core strategy.